My sister stole my inheritance, but she never expected me to fight back and win, and then I. The story of my family isn't a simple one. I'm Samantha, or Sam, as most people call me. I'm 29, and I've worked hard to create a stable life for myself. I have a good job, a modest savings account, and, as I've come to learn, a family dynamic that has shaped me in ways I'm still unpacking. My younger sister, Maddie, is 26 and, as far as anyone outside our family is concerned, the perfect golden child. Maddie is the kind of person who can walk into any room and immediately become its centerpiece. People are drawn to her in a way I've never quite understood. Maybe it's her confidence, or the way she makes you feel like you're the only one who matters when she speaks to you. Either way, it's always worked in her favor. Growing up, she could spill a drink on the carpet, and our parents would laugh it off as just Maddie being Maddie. Meanwhile, I'd be scolded for not noticing the spill sooner and cleaning it up before they saw it. My parents, Caroline and Richard, have never outright admitted their favoritism, but it's there in the subtle ways. Maddie's mistakes are quickly forgotten. Mine are picked apart, dissected, and sometimes even brought up years later as lessons to reflect on. For years, I tried to make peace with it. I focused on my grades, got a part-time job as soon as I was old enough, and did my best to stay out of trouble. It didn't earn me the kind of love Maddie received, but I thought it would at least earn me respect. My saving grace was my grandparents, Helen and Frank. They lived about 20 minutes from us, in a quaint house that always felt like a second home to me. The house was old but full of charm, the kind of place with creaky floorboards that sang with every step. The garden out back was Helen's pride and joy, filled with rows of lavender that filled the air with its calming scent. Helen and Frank didn't play favorites. They treated Maddie and me equally, and in their own quiet way, made me feel seen in a way my parents never had. Weekends at their house were my escape. Helen taught me how to bake, and Frank shared stories about his younger days, weaving tales of resilience and family bonds that felt like they were meant just for me. When they passed away recently, it felt like a part of me had gone with them. I knew they were getting older, but Helen and Frank had always been so full of life that it was hard to imagine a world without them. Their deaths came just months apart, as if one couldn't bear to be without the other. Losing them was like losing the anchors that kept me steady. At the funeral, Maddie arrived late. Typical Maddie. She swept into the room like a movie star, wearing a designer dress that screamed for attention. Her bright smile and casual laughter didn't fit the somber atmosphere, but no one seemed to notice. Everyone gravitated toward her, like moths to a flame. I sat quietly in a corner, trying to hold back tears while Maddie worked the room like it was a cocktail party. Our parents, predictably, couldn't get enough of her. They hung on her every word as if she were the one holding the family together instead of the one tearing it apart. I tried to remind myself why we were there, to honor Helen and Frank. This wasn't the time to let old grievances surface. After the funeral, I focused on what little comfort I could find. Helen and Frank had always made it clear that they wanted me to have their home when they were gone. It wasn't just a house to me. It was a symbol of everything they'd given me: stability, love, and a place where I felt I truly belonged. I thought about all the weekends I'd spent there, sitting with Helen in the kitchen while she wrote down recipes for me in her delicate handwriting, or helping Frank pull weeds in the garden while he shared advice about life and hard work. That house wasn't just theirs, it was ours. A few weeks after the funeral, I received a call from their lawyer, and I assumed it was to go over the details of the will. The house and part of their estate would go to me. That's what they'd always said. I expected the conversation to be straightforward. It wasn't. The lawyer began going over the details of the will, and my name wasn't mentioned. Not for the house. Not for the estate. Nothing. I sat there in stunned silence, trying to process what I was hearing. He continued, explaining that Maddie had been named the primary beneficiary. She got everything. I couldn't believe it. Helen and Frank had always been so clear about their intentions. This had to be some kind of mistake. I asked the lawyer if he was sure, and he told me the will had been updated recently, just a few weeks before Helen and Frank passed away. When I called Maddie to ask if she knew anything about this, she acted surprised. "Oh, wow," she said, her voice dripping with fake sincerity. "I had no idea. Maybe they thought you didn't need the money since you have a good job? I hung up the phone feeling like the ground beneath me had shifted. Something about her tone didn't sit right with me. Maddie wasn't just surprised. She sounded smug. I started digging through old emails and messages from Helen and Frank, looking for anything that might explain this sudden change. That's when I found it. A scanned copy of an earlier version of their will. It was exactly what I'd always believed. I was named as the primary beneficiary of the house and a significant portion of the estate. I confronted Maddie with the copy, but she shrugged it off. That's probably an old draft, she said. It doesn't matter if it's not the final version. She accused me of being ungrateful and stirring up drama, and when I tried to bring it up with our parents, they told me to let it go. What's done is done, my mom said. There's no point in tearing the family apart over this, but I couldn't let it go. Helen and Frank trusted me. They made their wishes clear, and I wasn't going to let Maddie rewrite their story. Something about the timing of the updated will, so close to their deaths, felt off. The Maddie I knew wouldn't have hesitated to push boundaries to get what she wanted. I made up my mind. If Maddie thought she could get away with this, she was wrong. Helen and Frank had always taught me to stand up for what was right, and that's exactly what I planned to do. For the first time in years, I wasn't going to let Maddie win. After finding the old copy of my grandparents' will, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. Helen and Frank weren't the type to make sudden decisions without telling me. They were careful, deliberate people who had always been transparent about their plans. For their will to be changed so close to their passing, it didn't make sense. I decided to speak to their lawyer again. His office was downtown, nestled in one of those aging brick buildings that seemed to mirror my growing frustration. I sat in the waiting room, my foot tapping anxiously on the worn carpet, rehearsing what I was going to say. When I finally sat across from him, I tried to keep my voice calm, even though my heart was pounding. I asked him to walk me through the details again, pressing him about how the changes to the will had come about. At first, he was hesitant, hiding behind professional language and vague statements about confidentiality. But I wasn't backing down. After what felt like an eternity of back and forth, he finally admitted something that made my stomach twist. Maddie had been heavily involved in the process. She'd visited the office multiple times, claiming she was helping Helen and Frank update their documents. She'd even provided some of the paperwork herself, saying it was at their request. Did my grandparents mention this to you? I asked him directly. He hesitated. Not to me personally, no. Most of the communication came through your sister. It was like a punch to the gut. Maddie had somehow inserted herself into the process, acting as if she was speaking on their behalf. My mind raced with questions. How had she managed to convince them to change everything? Had she pressured them? Tricked them? The timing, just weeks before their deaths, only deepened my suspicion. I left the lawyer's office feeling more determined than ever. If Maddie thought she could quietly rewrite my grandparents' wishes, she was wrong. I confronted her again that evening. I called her, and for once, I didn't sugarcoat my anger. Maddie, I spoke to the lawyer. He said you were involved in changing the will. What exactly did you say to them? She laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound that made my blood boil. Sam, are you serious? You're acting like I held a gun to their heads. They were adults. They made their own decisions. I tried to push her further, but she doubled down, accusing me of being jealous and bitter. Honestly, Sam, this isn't about you. Maybe they thought I deserved it. Did you ever think of that? Her words cut deep, but they didn't break me. If anything, they fueled my resolve. This wasn't just about me. It was about Helen and Frank and the trust they'd placed in me. As the days went by, the family tensions only escalated. When I tried to talk to my parents about what I'd learned, they brushed me off. Maddie wouldn't do something like that. My mom said, her tone firm, "You're reading too much into this. She's always been there for them," my dad added, as if her sporadic visits in their final months somehow outweighed years of my devotion to them. Their refusal to even entertain the idea that Maddie could have manipulated the situation was maddening. I was being painted as the troublemaker, the one stirring the pot, while Maddie played the innocent victim. Still, I wasn't about to back down. I started digging deeper into the timeline, trying to piece together what had really happened in those final weeks. I went through old text messages, emails, even photographs, looking for any clue that might explain how Maddie had pulled this off. Then, I found something, a scanned email from Helen, sent about 2 months before her passing. In it, she'd mentioned how much the house meant to me and how she knew I'd take care of it. She'd written, "This house is part of our family's history, and we know you'll honor that." It was exactly the kind of statement that proved how clear their intentions had been. I saved the email, along with every other scrap of evidence I could find. A few weeks later, at a family gathering, the divide became even more obvious. Maddie floated around the room, her laughter ringing out as she entertained relatives with stories about her recent good fortune. I watched as she carefully avoided making eye contact with me. My cousins, aunts, and uncles, who had always been warm toward me, now seemed distant. Maddie had clearly been spreading her version of events. "Sam's being dramatic," or "Sam's jealous" were the kinds of things I imagined her saying. And judging by the way people glanced at me from across the room, I knew her words were working. One cousin, Luke, pulled me aside. "I heard there's some drama about the will," he said, his voice cautious. "Drama? Is that what Maddie's calling it?" I shot back, unable to hide my frustration. He held up his hands. "I'm not picking sides. I just want to know the truth." I explained everything. How Helen and Frank had always intended for me to have the house. How Maddie had somehow inserted herself into the process, and how the timing of the will's changes didn't add up. Luke listened carefully, nodding as I spoke. "You should fight this," he said finally. "If what you're saying is true," Maddie crossed a line. His words gave me a small sense of validation, but I knew I needed more than support from one cousin. I needed undeniable proof. My breakthrough came when I revisited the lawyer. This time, I asked him directly about the specific changes Maddie had requested. He hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, but after some pressing, he admitted there were text messages and meeting logs that showed Maddie had been heavily involved in the process. "She was very persistent," he said, choosing his words carefully. I left his office with a mix of anger and determination. Maddie wasn't just a passive beneficiary. She had orchestrated this. That night, I decided enough was enough. If Maddie wanted to manipulate, lie, and twist the truth, I would make sure the real story came to light. Helen and Frank had trusted me, and I wasn't going to let their legacy be tainted by Maddie's greed. The fight wasn't going to be easy, but I was ready. For the first time, I felt like I was reclaiming control, not just over the inheritance, but over my own voice. Maddie had always been the one to dominate, to win, to charm her way through life. But not this time. This time, I would be the one to stand my ground. Once I had proof of Maddie's heavy involvement in changing my grandparents' will, I knew there was no turning back. If Helen and Frank had truly decided to rewrite their wishes, why hadn't they told me? Why was Maddie the middleman in every conversation with the lawyer? It didn't add up. I wasn't just fighting for the house or the inheritance. I was fighting for the truth. I started building my case, piece by piece. Every email, text message, and note from Helen and Frank became a clue. I combed through years of correspondence, searching for anything that might confirm what I already knew. They had wanted me to have the house. One night, while scrolling through old photos on my laptop, I stumbled across a scanned copy of a letter Helen had written me years ago. It wasn't about the inheritance, but it reminded me of how much they trusted me. In the letter, she wrote about how she and Frank believed I would carry on their legacy, how they saw me as someone who valued family and tradition. It wasn't much, but it was another reminder that their faith in me had been real. Meanwhile, Maddie wasn't exactly hiding her newfound wealth. She'd already bought herself a brand new car, a sleek, black luxury model that stood out like a sore thumb in our parents' driveway. Every time I saw it, my frustration grew. It wasn't just the car. It was what it represented. Maddie had taken something that wasn't hers and flaunted it like a trophy. I couldn't keep this fight to myself anymore. At a small family dinner one weekend, I decided to lay everything on the table. "Can we talk about the will?" I said, breaking the awkward silence that had settled over the table. Maddie rolled her eyes, leaning back in her chair with that familiar smirk. "Oh, here we go again." "I'm serious, Maddie," I said firmly, refusing to let her dismiss me. "The lawyer told me you were heavily involved in making the changes." Why didn't you tell anyone? I didn't think it was a big deal, she replied casually. Grandma and Grandpa asked me for help. I was just doing what they wanted. Her nonchalant tone made my blood boil. They never mentioned any of this to me, I said. Don't you think it's strange that they'd change everything so close to their passing without telling anyone? They didn't owe you an explanation, Maddie shot back, her voice rising. My parents jumped in before I could respond. Sam, enough, my mom said sharply. We don't need to keep dredging this up. Dredging it up? I repeated, my voice shaking. Mom, this isn't some petty argument. This is about Grandma and Grandpa's wishes. They trusted me. They wanted me to have the house, and Maddie stole that from me. Stole? Maddie scoffed, crossing her arms. That's rich coming from someone who's making this all about herself. The argument spiraled from there, with my parents defending Maddie and me trying to get them to see reason. By the end of the night, I felt like I was yelling into a void. No one wanted to believe that Maddie could be capable of something so underhanded. But I wasn't alone. After the dinner, my cousin Luke pulled me aside. I believe you, he said quietly. Maddie's always had a way of twisting things to get what she wants. If you need help, let me know. Luke's support gave me a small spark of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep me going. I decided to dig deeper into the timeline of the will's changes. I reached out to the lawyer again, this time asking for more specifics about Maddie's involvement. At first, he was reluctant to share anything, but after I pressed him, he admitted there were text messages and meeting notes that showed how Maddie had been orchestrating everything. She'd visited the office multiple times in the weeks leading up to the changes, claiming she was helping Helen and Frank. Did they ever express any hesitation about the changes? I asked him. The lawyer hesitated, then finally said, I can't say for certain, but they didn't seem fully aware of all the details. Maddie handled most of the communication. That was all I needed to hear. Maddie hadn't just taken advantage of the situation. She'd manipulated Helen and Frank in their final days, when they were most vulnerable. Armed with this new information, I confronted Maddie again. This time, I didn't hold back. You lied to them, I said, my voice shaking with anger. You manipulated them into changing the will, didn't you? Her reaction was pure deflection. Oh, come on, Sam. You're really going to accuse me of that? You're making yourself look desperate. Don't turn this around on me, I snapped. I've spoken to the lawyer. I know what you did. She stared at me for a moment, her confident facade faltering just slightly before she regained her composure. You have no proof, she said coldly, but I did have proof, or at least the beginnings of it. The lawyer's records, the old will, and even Helen's email were enough to show that something wasn't right. Maddie must have sensed that I wasn't going to back down, because she quickly pivoted to a new tactic, painting herself as the victim. Over the next few weeks, she started spreading her own version of events to the rest of the family, accusing me of being obsessed with the inheritance. At family gatherings, I noticed the shift in how people treated me. Relatives who had once been warm now avoided me, clearly buying into Maddie's narrative. Even so, I refused to let her win. I continued piecing together the evidence, reaching out to anyone who might have insight into my grandparents' final months. That's when I got an unexpected call from a distant cousin, Emily. I heard about the will, she said cautiously. I just thought you should know. I have some old recordings of Grandma and Grandpa talking about their plans for the house. They were so proud of you, Sam. They always said they wanted you to have it. The recordings were a gift I hadn't expected. Hearing my grandparents' voices again was bittersweet, but it reminded me of why I was fighting so hard. I wasn't just fighting for myself, I was fighting for them, for their memory, and for the trust they'd placed in me. With each new piece of evidence, my resolve grew stronger. Maddie could twist the story all she wanted, but I was going to expose the truth. Helen and Frank had always taught me to stand up for what was right, and now, I finally felt like I was doing just that. The day I decided to officially contest the will felt like stepping off a cliff, but I knew I had no other choice. Maddie had built a web of lies, and if I didn't fight back, she would get away with it. It wasn't just about the house or the money anymore. It was about standing up for Helen and Frank and everything they had trusted me to do. I hired a lawyer who specialized in contested wills. Her name was Catherine, a no-nonsense woman with a sharp mind and a fierce determination to see justice served. When I explained the situation to her, she listened carefully, asking questions to piece together the timeline of events. By the time I finished, her expression had hardened. "This isn't just a case of someone taking advantage," she said. "If Maddie pushed your grandparents into changing their will or manipulated them in any way, that's fraud. We'll need to prove it." Catherine's confidence gave me a sliver of hope. She immediately began gathering the evidence I had: the old will, Helen's email, the lawyer's records, and the recordings from Emily. She also suggested hiring a forensic document examiner to analyze the signatures on the updated will. "The timing is suspicious," Catherine said. "If your grandparents were in poor health, we need to consider whether they were even capable of fully understanding what they were signing." The legal process was grueling. Maddie was served papers a few days later, and her response was immediate and predictable. She called me in a fury, shouting that I was ruining her life. "Do you have any idea what you're doing?" she screamed over the phone. "You're tearing this family apart. You did that when you manipulated Grandma and Grandpa." I shot back. "This is on you, Maddie." My parents, of course, were quick to jump to her defense. My mom called me later that day, begging me to drop the case. "Sam, please," she said, her voice pleading. "This is only going to cause more pain for everyone." "Mom, it's already painful," I replied. "Maddie lied to all of us. She stole from Grandma and Grandpa. I can't just let that go." My dad was quieter, but no less disapproving. "Think about what this will do to the family," he said. "What about what she's already done?" I countered. "Why is it my responsibility to keep the peace when she's the one who caused all of this?" Their silence said everything. They didn't want to admit that Maddie might be in the wrong. As the case progressed, more details about Maddie's actions came to light. The forensic expert's analysis revealed discrepancies in the signatures on the updated will. According to the expert, the signatures didn't match my grandparents' usual handwriting. "These aren't just slight differences," the expert explained during a meeting with Catherine. "There are clear signs of forgery. Whoever signed this document was trying to mimic their handwriting, but it's not authentic." Hearing those words felt like validation, but it also made me furious. Maddie hadn't just manipulated my grandparents. She had forged their signatures to secure her place as the sole beneficiary. Catherine filed a motion to include the forensic report in our case, and the judge granted it. Maddie's lawyer tried to argue that the changes to the will were legitimate, claiming that Helen and Frank might have signed differently due to age or illness. But the forensic expert dismantled that argument piece by piece, pointing out how even with shaky hands, there were certain traits in their handwriting that wouldn't change. In the midst of all this, I discovered something even more damning. While reviewing bank statements, Catherine noticed a series of large withdrawals from my grandparents' account in the months before their deaths. The money had been funneled into Maddie's account under the guise of helping with expenses. What expenses? I muttered angrily as I looked at the records. A closer look revealed that Maddie had used the money to buy her luxury car, along with several other extravagant purchases. It was theft, plain and simple. When this evidence was added to the case, Maddie's defense started to crumble. Catherine presented the bank records in court, showing how Maddie had siphoned money from my grandparents' account while they were too frail to stop her. Maddie's reaction was explosive. During one hearing, she stood up and accused me of being greedy and obsessed with money. "This is ridiculous," she shouted. "Sam's just mad because Grandma and Grandpa liked me more." Her outburst didn't win her any sympathy. If anything, it made her look even more desperate. My parents, who had been firmly in Maddie's corner from the beginning, started to waver. My mom looked visibly uncomfortable every time new evidence was presented. My dad, who had always been more reserved, admitted during a quiet conversation with me that he wasn't sure Maddie was being truthful. "I don't know what to think anymore," he said, shaking his head. This isn't what I expected." It wasn't what I expected either, but I wasn't going to let Maddie's lies go unchecked. One of the most powerful moments in court came when we played the recordings from Emily. Hearing Helen's voice again brought tears to my eyes, but it also reminded me of why I was fighting. In the recordings, Helen talked about how much the house meant to me and how she wanted me to have it. "She'll take care of it," Helen said in one of the clips. Sam understands how important this place is to our family. The courtroom was silent as the recordings played. Maddie sat stiffly in her chair, her face pale. By the time the trial reached its final days, the truth was undeniable. The forged signatures, the stolen money, the recordings, all of it painted a clear picture of Maddie's deceit. When the judge finally delivered the verdict, it was like a weight had been lifted off my chest. The original will was reinstated, granting me the house and the inheritance my grandparents had intended. Maddie was ordered to return the money she'd taken, including what she'd spent on her car. As the ruling was read, Maddie sat frozen, her face a mix of shock and anger. For the first time, I saw her confidence truly crumble. After the hearing, my parents approached me. My mom, who had defended Maddie so fiercely, looked at me with tears in her eyes. "We're sorry," she said quietly. "We should have believed you." Their apology didn't erase the hurt, but it was a start. For the first time in months, I felt like I could finally breathe. The fight had been long and painful, but it was worth it. Helen and Frank had trusted me to do what was right, and I had honored their memory. Maddie's lies were exposed, and justice was served. For the first time, I felt like I had truly won. Not just the house, but the chance to move forward with my life. Winning the case felt like the end of a long, bitter war. I had fought for my grandparents' legacy and won, but the victory was bittersweet. The house, my grandparents' home, was finally mine, just as they had intended. Yet, the process of getting here had left cracks in my family that might never fully heal. I moved into the house a few weeks after the court ruling. Stepping through the front door felt surreal. The creaky floorboards and faint scent of lavender in the air brought back so many memories. I half expected to hear Helen humming in the kitchen or Frank's deep chuckle coming from the garden. It was comforting and heartbreaking all at once. I knew I couldn't just let the house sit as it was, a reminder of all the tension and grief. I decided to breathe new life into it while preserving the charm my grandparents loved. Renovations began almost immediately. I repainted the walls, updated the kitchen, and restored the worn-out furniture that had seen decades of family gatherings. In the garden, I planted rows of lavender and roses, just like Helen used to have. During one of my cleaning sprees, I found an old box tucked away in the back of a closet. Inside were treasures that made me laugh and cry. A stack of Helen's handwritten recipes, Frank's pocket watch, and even a bundle of letters they had exchanged when they were younger. Among the letters was one addressed to me. In it, they wrote about how proud they were of the person I had become. They reminded me of the importance of family, resilience, and standing up for what's right, no matter how difficult it might be. They also shared their hope that the house would continue to be a place of love and warmth, just as it had been for them. That letter became my anchor as I worked to rebuild what the fight had shattered. My parents, Caroline and Richard, made efforts to mend our relationship. My mom started showing up with little gifts, homemade casseroles or flowers for the garden. My dad offered to help with small repairs around the house. It wasn't a perfect apology, but it was something. I decided to meet them halfway. I didn't forget how they had defended Maddie at my expense, but I could see they were trying to make amends. Maddie, on the other hand, vanished. She didn't attend family gatherings, and the few times I heard about her, it was through whispers. Her flashy lifestyle had collapsed under the weight of legal fees and her tarnished reputation. Her luxury car had been repossessed, and she had reportedly left town. Part of me felt a pang of sadness for her, but it was overshadowed by the choices she had made. The house became my sanctuary, a place to start fresh. I wanted to honor my grandparents' memory in a meaningful way, so I used a portion of the inheritance to start a small charity in their name. The organization focused on helping seniors with home repairs, inspired by the countless times Frank had fixed fences or leaky roofs for neighbors without expecting anything in return. The charity gained traction quickly, with local businesses and volunteers stepping in to help. It felt like something Helen and Frank would have been proud of. I also began reconnecting with extended family. Some relatives reached out to apologize for believing Maddie's lies, while others brought old family heirlooms to contribute to the house. One aunt gifted me a beautiful quilt Helen had made years ago, and a cousin shared framed photos of past family reunions. Slowly, the house transformed into a living tribute to my grandparents and the family they had built. To celebrate the renovations and the charity launch, I hosted a small gathering at the house. Only the relatives who had supported me or reached out to mend relationships were invited. It was a modest event, filled with homemade food and laughter. For the first time in a long time, the house felt alive again, filled with the kind of joy Helen and Frank would have loved. Maddie's absence was noticeable, but no one brought her up. The peace I felt sitting in the garden that evening was unlike anything I had experienced in years. The fight was over, the truth had come out, and my grandparents' wishes had been honored. I know the scars from this ordeal will always be there. My relationship with Maddie may never recover, and the trust one lost in my parents will take time to rebuild. But I've made peace with that. Some wounds take longer to heal, or may never heal at all. What matters is that I stood my ground and did what was right, just as Helen and Frank would have wanted. Their legacy isn't just the house. It's the lessons they taught me about resilience, integrity, and love. As I sit here surrounded by the lavender plants swaying in the evening breeze, I feel their presence in every corner of this home. I carry them with me in everything I do, and for that, I'll always be grateful.